Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. True Crime for Sleep. I'm your guide into the darkest corners of the world, where shadows whisper and silence screams. Are you prepared to embrace the dark? If you're drawn to the world of true crime and unsolved mysteries, join our circle. Subscribe and enable all notifications. I am with you, and our lullaby starts right now. Jessica Gutierrez. Part 1. Some cold cases don't go cold because there are no clues. They go cold because no one looks closely enough. December 6, 1986. Lexington, South Carolina. A quiet neighborhood. Christmas decorations beginning to appear on front porches. A small house where a 4-year-old girl slept in her bedroom, unaware that her name would one day become part of a 35-year mystery. Jessica Gutierrez was just a child, small enough to still need help brushing her hair, young enough to believe monsters only lived in fairy tales. That night, her mother tucked her in as usual. The house was modest, familiar, safe. Or at least it was supposed to be. Sometime during the early morning hours, something changed. Jessica's older sister would later say she saw something strange. A man standing inside the bedroom, wearing what she described as a wizard hat. At the time, adults struggled to understand what she meant. Was it a dream? Was it imagination? Children sometimes mix fantasy with reality. But this wasn't fantasy. When morning came, Jessica was gone. Her bed was empty. The window was open. Cold air drifted into the room. There were no signs of forced entry that police could clearly identify. No loud noise that woke the household. Just silence and absence. When her family realized she was missing, panic set in immediately. They searched the house, the yard, called her name. Nothing. Police were notified. Officers arrived and began their standard procedures. Canvass the neighborhood. Check nearby roads. Ask neighbors if they heard anything unusual. But this was 1986. No surveillance cameras on every corner. No cell phone tracking. No digital footprint. Investigations relied on witness memory and physical evidence. And from the very beginning, mistakes were made. Officers reportedly treated the situation as a possible runaway. A 4-year-old runaway. Precious hours slipped by. The urgency that should have flooded the scene did not arrive fast enough. Evidence collection was limited. Crime scene preservation was not handled with the level of care we expect today. That window, that bedroom, potential footprints, fibers, fingerprints. Time erased many of them. Jessica's sister repeated her statement about the man in the hat. But some investigators doubted her. They questioned the reliability of a child's memory. They considered whether she had dreamed it. Yet children can sometimes recall vivid details adults overlook. The wizard hat description lingered in the file. Strange, specific, unexplained. Days turned into weeks. Search parties combed wooded areas. Volunteers distributed flyers. Jessica's face appeared on milk cartons. But no body was found. No ransom call. No confirmed sightings. The case began to fade from headlines. For the family, it never faded. For police, it quietly joined the growing list of unsolved disappearances. Cold cases are not dramatic. They don't explode with activity. They sit in file cabinets, on shelves, waiting. Years passed. The 1990s arrived. Then the 2000s. Jessica would have been starting school, then graduating, then becoming an adult. Her family marked birthdays without her. Each December felt heavier than the last. And yet somewhere inside that original file, clues remained untouched. Because even when evidence is mishandled, it doesn't disappear completely. It waits for better technology, better persistence, better attention. In 2021, something changed. The case was reopened, not because of a random tip, but because cold case units across the country were re-examining old files with modern forensic tools. Fingerprints collected decades earlier were entered into updated national databases. Old witness statements were re-reviewed. Detectives approached the file with fresh eyes and fresh skepticism. One question kept returning. What if the sister was telling the truth? What if the man in the wizard hat was real? Investigators began looking into known offenders in the area during the mid-1980s. Men with histories of violence. Men who lived nearby. One name surfaced repeatedly. Thomas McDowell. At the time of Jessica's disappearance, he lived close to her family. He had prior convictions, disturbing behavior patterns, and one critical detail. His fingerprints had been collected in previous arrests. When Jessica disappeared, fingerprint databases were far more limited. Matches were manual, slow, inconsistent. But in 2021, that changed. Old latent prints recovered from Jessica's bedroom were re-examined, enhanced, compared digitally. The match came back. Thomas McDowell. After 35 years, a fingerprint spoke. Investigators did not rush publicly. They built the case carefully. They re-interviewed witnesses. They revisited timelines. They searched for corroboration. Former neighbors were contacted. One former acquaintance reportedly recalled suspicious behavior around the time of the disappearance. Details that once seemed insignificant began aligning. Patterns emerged. Opportunity, proximity, history. The image of the wizard hat resurfaced in discussions. McDowell was known to wear unusual headwear at times. Was it coincidence? Or was a child's memory holding onto a fragment of truth all along? As detectives closed in, they faced a painful reality. Even with a suspect identified, Jessica's body had never been found. No grave, no remains, no final resting place. That absence made the case emotionally heavier. Forensic evidence could prove abduction, but it could not bring closure in the physical sense. Still, the fingerprint was powerful. It placed him inside her bedroom, inside a 4-year-old space. On the night she vanished, after decades of silence, an arrest was finally made. Thomas McDowell was charged in connection with Jessica's abduction and murder. For her family, the news was overwhelming. Relief, anger, grief reopening all at once. Because justice delayed is not justice denied. But it is complicated. 35 years is a lifetime. Jessica's parents had grown older. Family members had passed away. Some never saw this day. Cold cases don't just freeze victims in time. They freeze families in uncertainty. And when answers finally come, they do not feel clean. They feel heavy. Because behind every solved cold case is a question. If this had been handled differently in 1986, would she have been found sooner? Would she have been found at all? The reopening of Jessica's case became more than a resolution. It became a reminder that negligence in early hours can echo for decades, that children's testimonies deserve careful listening, and that sometimes the smallest physical trace, a fingerprint invisible to the eye, can outlive time itself. But this story doesn't end here, because identifying a suspect is not the same as proving guilt beyond doubt. And reopening a wound means reliving everything. In Part 2, we'll examine how investigators built the prosecution after 35 years, how testimony evolved over time, what role new witness statements played, and how a case once dismissed as nearly impossible became legally actionable. Because cold cases are not just about science. JSSICAGUTIRREZ. Part 2, 35 years is a long time to wait for justice. Memories fade. Witnesses move away. Evidence weakens. But sometimes what survives is enough. After the fingerprint match linked Thomas McDowell to Jessica's bedroom, investigators knew they had something powerful. But they also knew one thing very clearly. A fingerprint alone would not be enough to tell the entire story. They needed context. They needed corroboration. They needed to rebuild 1986. Detectives began retracing McDowell's life during that period. Where he lived, who he associated with, what vehicles he drove, what his daily routine looked like. Former neighbors were interviewed again. Some had never been asked detailed questions back then. Others admitted that police presence in 1986 had been brief. Too brief. One witness recalled seeing a man near the Gutierrez home late at night, around the time Jessica vanished. At the time, it didn't seem suspicious. It was a quiet neighborhood. People assumed safety. But hindsight changes perspective. Another individual remembered McDowell behaving strangely in the days following the disappearance. Withdrawn, agitated, watching news coverage obsessively. Back in 1986, that behavior may have gone unnoticed. In 2021, it mattered. Investigators also re-examined the physical layout of the home. The bedroom window, the surrounding yard. They asked themselves, could someone enter quietly? Could a child be removed without waking others? The answer was yes. The window showed signs, years later, consistent with entry from outside. And Jessica's sister's statement returned to center stage. The wizard hat. For decades, some had treated it as imagination. Now, detectives reviewed it differently. Children describe what they see in ways that make sense to them. A pointed hat. A shape unfamiliar. Maybe not a wizard hat. Maybe something else. A hood. A knit cap. Something distinctive. Investigators searched for photographs of McDowell from that time period. In some images, he wore unusual caps. Tall, oddly shaped. It was not proof, but it was alignment. As the case prepared for prosecution, legal teams faced a challenge. There was no body, no confession, no eyewitness placing him, physically carrying Jessica away. But circumstantial cases can be strong when evidence converges. The prosecution strategy focused on 3 pillars: presence, pattern, opportunity. Presence was established by the fingerprint. Pattern was supported by McDowell's criminal history. Opportunity was undeniable. He lived nearby and had access. The defense, as expected, challenged the fingerprint. They questioned chain of custody. They questioned preservation methods from 1986. They argued contamination was possible. After all, standards decades ago were not what they are today. The prosecution responded by presenting forensic experts. They explained how latent prints were collected, how they were preserved, how modern enhancement techniques simply clarified what was already there. They emphasized that the fingerprint was found in Jessica's bedroom, not on a public surface. not somewhere explainable by coincidence. Inside, in a child's room, on the night she disappeared. That placement was difficult to dismiss. Meanwhile, Jessica's family prepared themselves for court. Reliving trauma is a different kind of suffering. Each hearing reopens wounds. Each photograph shown feels like salt. Her sister, now an adult, carried the weight of that childhood memory. For years, she wondered if people believed her, if she had imagined it, if she could have done more. Now, her words from decades ago were central. She testified again, her voice older, steadier, but still carrying the echo of that night. She described the shape she saw, the stillness, the figure standing where no one should have been. The courtroom listened differently this time, because now there was a fingerprint to anchor her memory. Cold case prosecutions are complex. Defense teams often argue delay itself is prejudice. Memories degrade. Witness reliability weakens. But juries are instructed to weigh evidence, not just time. The prosecution reminded them, time does not erase responsibility. It only postpones confrontation. The absence of Jessica's body remained the heaviest absence. Search efforts over the years had failed. Landscapes changed. Properties developed. Potential burial sites disturbed unknowingly. For her family, that meant no grave. No physical place to mourn. Only memory. And now a courtroom. As proceedings continued, investigators reflected privately on the original handling of the case. Some admitted mistakes. Some acknowledged urgency had not been what it should have been. But they also emphasized something else. Cold cases are not closed cases. They are waiting cases. Waiting for better science. Waiting for renewed attention. Waiting for someone to care enough to reopen the file. When the prosecution rested, the picture presented was not based on drama. It was based on accumulation. A fingerprint preserved across decades. A child's memory dismissed too quickly. A suspect living close enough to reach through a window. A pattern of behavior consistent with predatory acts. And a disappearance with no innocent explanation. For Jessica's family, the trial was not about vengeance. It was about acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that she did not simply vanish. That someone took her. That someone entered her room. That someone ended her life. Justice in cold cases rarely feels triumphant. It feels quiet, heavy, measured, because even when a verdict comes, it does not bring back the child who would now be nearly 40 years old. It does not restore lost birthdays. It does not erase decades of wondering. But it does something important. It replaces silence with accountability. Jessica Gutierrez was 4 years old when she was taken. For 35 years, her case sat in uncertainty. But evidence waited. And when the world finally caught up with that evidence, it spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough. And sometimes, after decades of darkness, clarity is the closest thing to light a family can receive. Ben bujet hienos, ben akon enus ben teke enus, ben potted enus ben keshenos ben shudu enus, ben ploti enus ben keshenos tu ben patto enus, ben ploti enus ben patto enus ben shabdo enus, ben jadko enus ben documentari enus, ben emotional enus ben nachti enus, ben poishob halenus, ben take shot enus, out ben type enus, ben kichu enus, ben tacobe enus, ben na enus, ben amorainus, ben akon enus, ben shudu enus, ben kodobo enus. Debbie Randall case, part 1 3000 ben shabdo enus, ben acta enus, ben kota enus, ben agi enus, ben boli enus, ben taki enus. 3000 ben shabdo enus, ben Akenos, ben Meshajaenos, ben Dilaenos, ben Machaenos, ben Machaenos, ben Chaconicalenos, ben Catenos, ben Hoyenos, ben Jateanos, ben Pateanos, ben Amienos, ben Jototaenos, ben Shampabenos, ben Fulalentoenos, ben Dienos, ben Shuduenos, ben Cochienos, ben Jodienos, ben Majhocaneanos, ben Cachaenos, ben Porienos, ben Amienos, ben Shateanos, ben Shateanos, ben Continuenos, ben Cotoboenos, ben Shuduenos, ben Cochienos. DBBIRANDLL. Part 1. August 1972. A summer afternoon that should have felt ordinary. A laundromat humming with the low mechanical rhythm of spinning machines. The scent of detergent in the air. Mothers folding clothes. Children shifting impatiently on plastic chairs. 12-year-old Debbie Randolph had been sent on a simple errand. Wash the family's laundry. It was routine. Safe. Familiar. She wasn't supposed to disappear. Debbie was described as responsible for her age. Independent, but still very much a child. She wore her hair simply. Carried herself with quiet confidence. There was nothing dramatic about that afternoon. Nothing that suggested it would end in violence. Witnesses later said they saw Debbie inside the laundromat, loading machines, sorting clothes. At some point, she stepped outside. No one is certain why. Maybe to check on something. Maybe someone called her name. Maybe she was lured. And in that brief, unguarded moment, she vanished. When her family realized she hadn't returned home, worry grew quickly. Unlike adults, children don't just choose to disappear. Hours passed. Calls were made. Friends contacted. Police notified. Search efforts began. Officers canvassed nearby streets. Knocked on doors. Asked if anyone saw a girl leaving with someone. Descriptions were gathered, but the answers were vague. It was 1972. Surveillance cameras did not monitor parking lots. License plates weren't automatically scanned. Investigators relied on memory. And memory is fragile. Days turned into weeks. Then the discovery. Debbie's body was found. Discarded. The brutality of her murder stunned the community. She had been assaulted, killed, left behind as if her life had no weight. The town changed after that. Parents tightened rules. Children were no longer sent alone to small errands. Fear replaced routine. The investigation intensified. Detectives interviewed dozens of individuals. Local men were questioned. Transient workers examined. Known offenders scrutinized. But nothing stuck. Physical evidence was limited. Forensic science in 1972 was basic compared to modern standards. DNA testing did not yet exist in criminal investigations. Biological evidence could be collected, but it could not be analyzed at the genetic level. So samples were stored, carefully packaged, labeled, then placed into evidence storage, waiting for technology that did not yet exist. Suspects came and went. Some were cleared. Others remained persons of interest. Rumors circulated in the community. Accusations whispered. But no arrest was made. The case began to cool. Not because detectives stopped caring, but because they ran out of tools. Cold cases do not freeze suddenly. They slow down. Fewer leads, fewer calls, fewer headlines, until eventually the file sits in a cabinet marked unsolved. Debbie's family lived with unanswered questions. Birthdays passed. High school graduation years passed. Each milestone marked not by celebration, but by imagining what could have been. And somewhere in an evidence locker, biological material remained sealed, untested, unusable at the time, but preserved. In the 1980s, DNA science began emerging. By the 1990s, it was reshaping criminal justice. Cold cases across the country were reopened. Evidence long considered useless was re-examined. But not every case moved quickly. Budget limitations slowed testing. Prioritization favored recent violent crimes. Debbie's file remained on a shelf longer than her family hoped. Then in 2015, something changed. Investigators reopened the Randall case formally. They located preserved biological samples, sent them to modern forensic labs. Scientists extracted DNA profiles. What once could not be seen was now measurable. Genetic markers, unique identifiers. The lab developed a usable DNA profile from evidence collected decades earlier. That alone was significant. But a profile without a match is just data. The DNA was entered into national databases. No immediate hit. The perpetrator's DNA was not in the system, which meant one of two things. He had never been arrested for a qualifying offense, or he had never been caught at all. Investigators did not stop there. They turned to genetic genealogy, a technique that compares crime scene DNA to publicly available genealogy databases. Instead of matching the suspect directly, it searches for relatives, distant cousins, shared ancestry, fragments of connection. It's like building a family tree backward from a single strand of DNA. The process is slow, meticulous. Family trees branch widely. Names multiply. Records are cross-referenced. Birth certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries. From one DNA sample, genealogists began constructing potential lineage. Eventually, the search narrowed. One family line connected to a man named Robert Rose. In 1972, Rose had been living near the laundromat. He had a criminal history, minor offenses at the time, nothing that had tied him directly to Debbie's murder. Until now, investigators discreetly began surveillance. They needed a confirmatory DNA sample, but they couldn't simply request it without cause. So they waited. In cases like this, discarded items often provide answers. A cup thrown in trash, a cigarette butt, a napkin. Eventually, investigators obtained an item Rose had discarded publicly. It was sent to the lab, compared against the 1972 crime scene DNA. The match was definitive. After more than 4 decades, the biological evidence spoke clearly. Robert Rose was arrested in 2022. The announcement shocked those who remembered the case. Many had assumed it would remain unsolved forever. But time does not protect DNA. It preserves it. Debbie Randall's case had waited 50 years. 50 years for science to catch up. 50 years for a name to be attached to the crime. Her family, older now, stood before cameras and spoke. They described the long silence, the decades without answers, the birthdays imagined but never lived. Justice delayed is not simple. It does not erase pain, but it confirms truth. And truth, even late, matters. In Part 2, we'll explore how the genetic genealogy process unfolded in detail, what Robert Rose's life looked like in the decades after the murder, how the trial confronted evidence from half a century earlier, and how a community finally faced a truth buried since 1972. Melissa TRMBLAY. Part 1. September 1988. A rail yard in Lawrence, Massachusetts. metal tracks stretching into the distance, freight cars sitting still in the late summer air, an industrial landscape that felt empty. But it wasn't empty. 11-year-old Melissa Tremblay had come to visit her grandparents for the weekend. It was supposed to be ordinary, safe, temporary. She lived in Salem, New Hampshire, but that weekend she was spending time with family. She had gone to the local carnival. Bright lights, music, children running between rides, cotton candy sticking to small fingers. Melissa was last seen near that carnival. Then she disappeared. At first, no one panicked. Children wander, especially during crowded events. But as minutes turned into hours, worry tightened. Her grandparents searched, called her name, checked familiar places. Nothing. Police were notified. Search efforts began quickly. Officers canvassed the carnival area. Witnesses were interviewed. Descriptions collected. But carnivals are chaotic environments. Strangers move in and out. Temporary workers arrive from other towns. Faces blur together. The next morning, a horrifying discovery was made. Melissa's body was found near a rail yard. She had been stabbed, left alone in an industrial space. The brutality stunned investigators. 11 years old, a child who had come for a weekend visit. The crime scene revealed violence, but it also revealed something else: biological evidence. In 1988, DNA testing was in its early stages. Investigators collected samples carefully, but the technology to analyze them fully was limited. A partial DNA profile was eventually developed. Partial, not complete, meaning it could exclude suspects, but not always identify one definitively. Detectives worked tirelessly. They questioned carnival workers, local men, anyone who had been near the area that night. Sketches were created. Tips poured in, but none solidified into an arrest. The partial DNA profile was entered into databases as they became available. Years passed. No match. Melissa's case slowly joined the long list of unsolved child murders. Her family carried the weight. Birthdays without her. Christmases marked by absence. The rail yard remained. The carnival moved on each year. But Melissa's story lingered. Investigators revisited the file multiple times over decades. They tested suspects, compared DNA samples, eliminated many, but the partial profile remained just that: incomplete, like a fingerprint missing key ridges. Then in 2014, something changed. Genetic genealogy began reshaping cold case investigations. Instead of waiting for a direct database hit, investigators could now search for familial connections in public genealogy platforms. A partial DNA profile could still be useful. Even incomplete genetic markers can link to distant relatives. It is not simple. It requires patience. Genealogists build family trees stretching back generations. They trace cousins, second cousins, third cousins. Names branch like roots underground. In Melissa's case, investigators decided to try. They uploaded the genetic data into a genealogy database that permitted law enforcement use. Matches came back. Not suspects, relatives, distant, but real. From there, genealogists began constructing a family tree. They narrowed lines, cross-referenced age ranges, geographic locations. Men who would have been adults in 1988. Men connected to Lawrence or the Carnival area. One name emerged: Marvin McLendon. In 1988, McLendon was stationed at a nearby military base. He was young, in the area at the time of Melissa's murder. He had no criminal record tying him to violent crime then, which explained why his DNA had never appeared in law enforcement databases. Investigators needed confirmation. They began surveillance discreetly, watched his routines, waited for a discarded item. Eventually, they obtained a DNA sample from something he threw away. It was tested, compared against the preserved 1988 evidence. The match was strong, powerful enough to move forward. In 2022, Marvin McLendon was arrested and charged with the murder of Melissa Tremblay. More than 3 decades had passed. 34 years. For Melissa's family, the news was overwhelming. They had grown older. Some family members had died waiting. Now suddenly, a name was attached to the horror. But cold case arrests are only the beginning of another battle. Because arrest is not conviction. And in cases built partly on genealogy and partial DNA, legal challenges are intense. The prosecution prepared to present the genetic genealogy process clearly. They knew defense attorneys would question its reliability. They would argue privacy concerns. They would attempt to frame genealogy as speculative. The trial began in 2023. Jurors listened as prosecutors described the carnival night, the rail yard, the preserved evidence, the genealogy process that led to McLendon. The defense pushed back hard. They argued that the DNA profile was partial. They questioned whether genealogical narrowing created bias. They suggested alternative suspects had not been fully excluded decades earlier. Tension built in the courtroom. Melissa's family attended daily, listening to details long buried in police reports, watching science attempt to reconstruct a crime from 1988. But then something unexpected happened. The first trial ended in a mistrial, not because of acquittal, not because of innocence proven, but because the jury could not reach unanimous agreement. Deadlock. Some jurors were convinced by the DNA evidence. Others hesitated, perhaps unsettled by the partial nature of the original profile, perhaps cautious about genetic genealogy. The result was not freedom. It was delay. A retrial was scheduled. For Melissa's family, the mistrial reopened uncertainty. After decades of waiting, they were now waiting again. The legal system moves carefully, and sometimes carefully means slowly. In Part 2, we will explore why the jury deadlocked, how experts handled the limitations of a partial DNA profile, what arguments dominated the courtroom, and what the retrial could mean for justice after more than 3 decades. Because in cold cases, even after a name is found, the fight for certainty is not over. Melissa Tremblay. Part 2. When the first trial ended in a mistrial, the word echoed heavily in the courtroom. Mistrial. Not guilty was not spoken. Guilty was not declared. Just deadlock. For Melissa's family, it felt like time bending backward. 34 years of waiting. An arrest. A trial. And now uncertainty again. But mistrials do not erase evidence. They simply mean 12 people could not agree. To understand why, you have to look closely at what the jury heard. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on DNA, but not just traditional DNA. Genetic genealogy, and a partial profile preserved from 1988. For some jurors, that science was compelling. For others, it raised questions. The original DNA sample collected in 1988 was incomplete, degraded by time. Not enough for a full modern profile, but enough to extract key markers. Those markers were uploaded into a genealogy database. The system did not produce a direct match. Instead, it identified distant relatives. From there, experts built family trees, narrowed possibilities, eventually landing on Marvin McLendon. The prosecution explained that genealogy was only an investigative tool. It pointed them in a direction. The real evidence, they argued, was the confirmatory DNA match obtained from McLendon's discarded item. That sample matched the preserved crime scene DNA. But defense attorneys focused on the word partial. They emphasized it repeatedly. Partial profile, partial markers, partial data. They argued that partial DNA leaves room for doubt. They questioned how much genetic material was available. They asked whether degradation over time could create false alignments. They suggested the genealogical narrowing process might introduce bias. Once investigators focused on McLendon, the defense argued they may have interpreted evidence through that lens. Jurors are instructed to convict only if guilt is proven beyond reasonable doubt. In modern cases with full DNA profiles, doubt is often minimal. In cold cases with partial samples, perception becomes more complex. The defense also pointed out that McLendon had lived a relatively stable life. No violent criminal record. No documented history of child assault. They asked jurors to consider whether it made sense that a man could commit such a brutal crime and then live decades without similar behavior. The prosecution responded carefully. They reminded jurors that absence of prior convictions does not equal innocence. They explained that many violent offenders commit one known crime. They highlighted that McLendon had been stationed near the carnival in 1988, had opportunity, had proximity. They returned again and again to the DNA confirmation. Experts took the stand to explain how partial DNA still carries identifying power. They described genetic markers like coordinates. Even if you don't have the full map, enough coordinates can still point to one location. They clarified statistical probabilities. The likelihood of another, unrelated individual matching those markers was extremely low. But statistics can feel abstract. Defense attorneys leaned into that abstraction. They asked experts whether extremely low means impossible. It does not. They asked whether contamination over 3 decades could be fully ruled out. Experts testified that chain of custody protocols had been followed. Evidence had been stored carefully. But absolute guarantees are difficult to state in science. That nuance may have influenced some jurors. Deliberations stretched. Jurors debated. Some reportedly felt the DNA was compelling enough. Others felt hesitation because the original profile was incomplete. In criminal trials, unanimity is required. Even one juror with reasonable doubt can prevent a verdict. Eventually, the judge declared a mistrial. The jury was hopelessly deadlocked. For Melissa's family, the announcement was devastating. Not because McLendon was cleared. He was, but because closure slipped away again. Cold cases test patience. This case now tested endurance. After the mistrial, prosecutors announced they would retry the case. They believed strongly in the evidence. They believed the science would hold. They began preparing again, refining expert testimony, anticipating defense challenges, strengthening explanations of genetic genealogy. Meanwhile, public discussion intensified. Some questioned the use of genealogy databases in criminal investigations. Privacy advocates debated ethical boundaries. Others argued that solving child murder cases justified the technique. Melissa's case became part of a broader national conversation about forensic innovation. Behind that debate stood a simple truth. An 11-year-old girl had been stabbed and left near a rail yard. Her family had waited more than 3 decades. And now science had pointed to one man. The retrial was scheduled for 2024. Prosecutors would once again present the DNA evidence. They would again explain how genealogy narrowed the suspect pool. They would emphasize that the confirmatory DNA sample came directly from McLendon himself. The defense would likely repeat arguments about partial profiles and doubt. Retrials can unfold differently. Jurors are different people. Explanations can be clearer. Strategies adjusted, but uncertainty always remains. Cold cases are fragile in court, not because the crimes are less serious, but because time complicates memory and perception. Melissa Tremblay was 11 years old. She went to a carnival. She never came home. For decades, her name sat in a file labeled unsolved. Then science moved forward, and a name emerged. But justice does not arrive simply because science points. It must pass through 12 minds in a jury box. And sometimes that path is not straight. As the retrial approaches, one thing remains constant. The DNA has not changed. The evidence preserved in 1988 has not changed. Only interpretation stands between accusation and conviction. For Melissa's family, hope is cautious now. They have learned that cold cases rarely resolve cleanly. But they continue to sit in court, to listen, to wait, because after 34 years of silence, even the possibility of resolution is something they refuse to surrender. Tmy Van Cumberland and J. Cook. Part 1. November 1987. 2 young Canadians. A road trip. A promise of opportunity. Tanya Van Kylenborg was 20 years old. Jay Cook was 20. They left British Columbia in a van loaded with supplies. The plan was simple. Drive to Seattle. Deliver materials for a furnace installation. Return home. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous. It wasn't supposed to be historic. It was just work. A favor. A trip across the border that thousands of people make every year without consequence. But they never made it home. On November 24, 1987, Tanya's body was found in a ditch in Skagit County, Washington. She had been assaulted, shot in the back of the head, her hands bound. Days later, Jay's body was discovered in a separate location. Beaten, strangled, left in a wooded area. 2 bodies, 2 scenes. One story fractured across distance. The van was found abandoned in Bellingham. Inside, investigators collected evidence. Fingerprints, biological samples, fibers. In 1987, forensic science was evolving but limited. DNA testing existed in early form, but it was not widely applied. Evidence was carefully stored, cataloged, preserved. Investigators built timelines. Tanya and Jay had been seen at different locations after crossing the border. They had likely encountered someone who gained their trust, or forced compliance. The brutality of the crime shocked both sides of the border. Canadian media followed the case intensely. So did Washington authorities. But leads were thin. Witnesses remembered seeing the van. Some recalled a man near it. Descriptions were vague. Composite sketches were created. Tips poured in. None led to arrest. Over time, DNA testing improved. Biological evidence from Tanya's assault was analyzed. a male DNA profile was developed. It was entered into CODIS. No match. The killer had never been arrested for a qualifying offense. The fingerprints recovered from the van were also preserved. Compared against known offenders. No match. The case slowly drifted into cold status. But investigators refused to discard it. They revisited it periodically, retested evidence as technology improved. The DNA profile remained consistent. A single unknown male. Somewhere. Living. Perhaps unaware that science was advancing toward him. Years turned into decades. Tanya and Jay's families marked anniversaries quietly. They crossed the border repeatedly to attend memorials. They spoke publicly, refusing to let the case fade. In 2018, something changed. Genetic genealogy had begun transforming cold case investigations. Instead of waiting for a suspect's DNA to appear in a criminal database, investigators could search public genealogy platforms for familial connections. The DNA profile from Tanya's assault was uploaded to a genealogy database that allowed law enforcement access. Matches appeared. Not direct matches, but relatives, distant cousins. Investigators partnered with genealogists. They began constructing family trees, tracing lines back through generations, mapping branches, narrowing by age and geography. The tree eventually pointed toward one man, William Talbot Ayai. He had lived in Washington State in 1987. He would have been 24 at the time of the murders. He had no major violent criminal record, which explained why his DNA had never been in CODIS. Investigators moved carefully. They did not arrest immediately. They needed confirmation. Surveillance began. Talbot was observed in public. At one point, he discarded a coffee cup. Investigators retrieved it, sent it to the lab. The DNA extracted from the cup was compared to the preserved 1987 sample. The match was definitive, not partial, not ambiguous, definitive. In 2018, more than 30 years after Tanya and Jay were murdered, William Talbot was arrested. The announcement rippled across media outlets in both countries. For the families, it felt surreal. 3 decades of waiting. 3 decades of imagining the man responsible. Now he had a name, a face, a courtroom date. But arrest is only the beginning. In Part 2, we will explore how prosecutors built the case using genealogy and DNA, how fingerprints collected in 1987 resurfaced, what defense arguments challenged the evidence, and how a discarded coffee cup ultimately connected a man to 2 lives lost in 1987. Because sometimes, justice waits quietly in preserved evidence, and sometimes it waits in something as ordinary as a paper cup thrown into the trash. Tnya Van Sewell Mborg and Jay Cook. Part 2. When William Talbot was arrested in 2018, the breakthrough felt almost cinematic. A discarded coffee cup, a strand of DNA, 3 decades of silence broken. But inside the courtroom, there is no cinema. There is only evidence, and how well it withstands challenge. Prosecutors built their case around 3 core pillars: DNA, fingerprints, and timeline. The DNA evidence was the most powerful. The biological sample collected from Tanya in 1987 had been preserved carefully, tested as technology advanced. The profile developed years later was clear and usable. When that profile was uploaded to a genealogy database, distant relatives surfaced. From there, genealogists narrowed potential family branches. Age ranges, geographic proximity, men living in Washington in 1987. Eventually, the tree pointed toward William Talbot. But the prosecution made one thing very clear. Genetic genealogy did not convict Talbot. It only pointed investigators toward him. The real confirmation came from the coffee cup. When Talbot discarded it in public, detectives retrieved it lawfully. The DNA extracted from the cup was compared to the preserved crime scene profile. The match was statistically overwhelming. The probability of another, unrelated individual matching that profile was astronomically low. Defense attorneys challenged the genealogy process aggressively. They questioned the use of public DNA databases. They raised privacy concerns. They implied investigative bias once Talbot became the genealogical focus. They argued that family tree narrowing can create tunnel vision. But prosecutors returned repeatedly to the confirmatory sample. The coffee cup DNA was not genealogical speculation. It was direct comparison, marker by marker, sequence by sequence. It matched. Then came the fingerprints. Back in 1987, investigators had lifted fingerprints from the van Tanya and Jay were driving. At the time, they were compared manually against existing records. No match. But decades later, fingerprint databases were more comprehensive. When Talbot was arrested, his prints were taken, compared against the preserved prints from the van. They matched. That detail strengthened the case significantly. Now it wasn't only biological evidence from Tanya. It was physical presence inside the van. The vehicle both victims had occupied before their deaths. The timeline also mattered. Prosecutors placed Talbot in the region during the exact period Tanya and Jay disappeared. He lived nearby, had no solid alibi documented for the critical window. He was 24 years old at the time, young enough to blend in, old enough to commit violence. The defense attempted to create doubt through character. They pointed out that Talbot had lived quietly for decades. No known violent convictions. No pattern of similar crimes. They suggested that if he were capable of such brutality, there would be other victims. But absence of record does not equal absence of crime. Prosecutors emphasized that some offenders commit a single known act, or simply never get caught again. The courtroom atmosphere was intense. Tanya and Jay's families traveled from Canada to attend proceedings. They listened to forensic testimony that described their loved one's final hours in clinical detail. That is the harsh reality of trials. Grief becomes evidence. One of the most pivotal moments came when forensic experts explained the DNA probability. They simplified it for jurors. The odds that the DNA belonged to someone other than Talbot were so small they were effectively negligible. Defense attorneys cross-examined carefully. They asked about contamination, about storage conditions from 1987, about laboratory procedures. Experts testified that the evidence had been preserved properly, that chain of custody records were intact, that modern testing followed strict protocols. Jurors weighed everything, not just science, but demeanor, consistency, logic. After deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Guilty on 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. For Tanya and Jay's families, the word carried 30 years of weight. There were tears, not loud celebration, just quiet release, because justice after 3 decades does not feel triumphant. It feels overdue. William Talbot was sentenced to life in prison without parole. No possibility of release. The coffee cup that connected him to the crime became symbolic. Ordinary, disposable, yet decisive. This case became one of the first high-profile convictions secured through genetic genealogy. It demonstrated the power of preserved evidence. It also sparked national conversation about privacy and forensic innovation. But for the families, the conversation was simpler. Their children had names. Their killer now had accountability. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 20. Jay Cook was 20. They left home for a routine trip. They never returned. For 30 years, the man responsible lived quietly, unknown publicly, but his DNA waited, stored in a lab, frozen in evidence, until technology matured enough to identify him. Cold cases often rely on patience, on preservation, on the belief that time does not erase truth. In this case, time did not protect the killer. It protected the evidence. And when science finally caught up, it spoke clearly. 2 young lives were taken in 1987. 3 decades later, their story was no longer a question. It was a resolved fact. And sometimes, in the world of cold cases, that is the closest thing to justice that exists. DBBIRANDLL. Part 2. When Robert Rose was arrested in 2022, he was no longer the man he had been in 1972. His hair had thinned. His face had aged. Decades had passed. But DNA does not age. It does not forget. And it does not care how much time has gone by. The confirmation match between the crime scene sample and Rose's discarded DNA was described by investigators as conclusive. Not partial, not uncertain, conclusive. For Debbie's family, the phone call bringing that news carried a strange mix of relief and reopening. Because for 50 years, they had lived in a state of suspended grief. Not knowing who, not knowing why, not knowing if the person responsible was still out there. Now they had a name, but that name came with a deeper question. How does someone live 50 years after committing a crime like this? Investigators began reconstructing Rose's life. In 1972, he had been living near the laundromat Debbie visited. He was young, local, within walking distance. There was no record that he had ever been seriously considered as a suspect at the time, which raised another difficult possibility. Had he slipped through early investigative gaps? Back then, law enforcement relied heavily on interviews and witness reports. Without DNA technology, biological evidence could not point to a specific individual. If Rose was questioned in 1972, there was no surviving indication that he stood out. Over the decades, he moved, built a life, worked jobs, interacted with neighbors. Nothing publicly tying him to Debbie's murder, which is often the most unsettling part of cold case arrests. The suspect blends into normal life, while a family remains frozen in loss. When authorities publicly announced the arrest, many community members reacted with shock. Some remembered Debbie's case vividly. Others had only heard fragments, but all recognized the weight of 5 decades passing before accountability. The prosecution faced a unique challenge. They were preparing a case built on evidence collected half a century earlier. Witness memories were fragile. Some had passed away. Physical locations had changed. Buildings renovated or demolished. The laundromat itself no longer looked as it did in 1972. But the DNA was powerful, and modern juries understand DNA in a way earlier generations did not. Still, defense attorneys questioned the genetic genealogy process. They argued privacy concerns, They questioned the chain of custody from 1972. They scrutinized storage methods. They examined whether contamination could have occurred. Because when a case is this old, any uncertainty becomes a defense strategy. Forensic experts took the stand to explain the science clearly. They described how the original biological material was preserved, how extraction methods in 2015 avoided degradation, how genealogical analysis narrowed potential family lines, and how the confirmatory sample taken from Rose's discarded item was an exact match to the crime scene profile. Not statistically similar, exact within forensic certainty standards. The prosecution emphasized that genetic genealogy only pointed them in a direction. The actual arrest was based on the confirmed DNA match, a match placing Rose directly at the crime scene. During trial proceedings, Debbie's family attended consistently. They had waited decades for this moment, but the courtroom did not feel victorious. It felt heavy. They listened as evidence described the violence Debbie endured. Details that had once been shielded to protect them were now spoken aloud. There is a particular cruelty in revisiting trauma after 50 years. Grief that had been quiet suddenly becomes public again. The defense attempted to suggest alternative explanations. They questioned whether the biological evidence could have been transferred indirectly. They implied investigative tunnel vision once Rose became the genealogical focus. But prosecutors returned repeatedly to probability. The likelihood that DNA from an unrelated person would match the preserved evidence was astronomically small. They also reminded the jury that Rose lived nearby at the time, had opportunity, had no alibi documented for the hours Debbie vanished, and that he had never voluntarily provided DNA earlier. Closing arguments were measured. There was no dramatic flourish, no cinematic confession, just science, time, and the weight of consistency. When the verdict came, it represented more than a legal conclusion. It represented validation. Validation that Debbie's case had mattered. That evidence preserved in 1972 had not been forgotten. That patience, though painful, had not been wasted. For Debbie's family, the conviction did not bring her back. It did not erase 5 decades of wondering, but it removed the question mark that had lingered over her memory. She was not just a tragic headline from the 1970s. She was a child whose life was taken, and whose killer was finally identified. Cold cases teach difficult lessons. They reveal investigative limitations of their time. They show how technology evolves, but they also highlight something else: persistence. Evidence collected carefully, even without immediate answers, can become powerful decades later. The detectives who sealed Debbie's biological samples in 1972 likely had no idea that science would one day unlock them. But they preserved them anyway, and that preservation changed everything. Debbie Randall was 12 years old. She walked into a laundromat on a summer afternoon. She never walked out. For 50 years, her story remained unfinished, until science, patience, and refusal to forget finally gave it an ending. Not a happy ending, but a truthful one. And in cold cases, truth is often the closest thing to justice a family can receive. Corinne SNIDR. Part 1, 1966. Long before DNA databases. Long before genetic genealogy. Long before forensic science could speak with certainty. Corinne Snyder was young, married, and living what many assumed was a stable life. From the outside, nothing about her world suggested it would end violently. But appearances are often fragile. When Corinne was found murdered, The shock rippled quickly through her community. This was not random street violence. This was personal. The scene told investigators one thing immediately. She had fought back. There were signs of struggle, evidence of resistance, blood, disarray, fear frozen in the space she had once called safe. As detectives began their work, attention naturally turned toward the most statistically likely suspect, her husband. In cases involving married victims, investigators often start there, not because of bias, but because proximity matters, opportunity matters, and emotional conflict often lives behind closed doors. Corinne's husband was questioned extensively. He cooperated. He answered timelines. He allowed searches. He denied involvement. At first glance, there were no immediate inconsistencies, no visible injuries, no obvious motive beyond speculation. But the investigation did not stop there. Witnesses were interviewed. Neighbors asked if they had seen or heard anything unusual. And then something shifted. Another man entered the picture. James Barbier. He was known in the area. Familiar, not initially central to the case. But during questioning, detectives noticed something unusual. Injuries, fresh scratches, marks that appeared defensive. In 1966, forensic analysis was limited. But even then, investigators understood one basic truth. Victims who fight back leave evidence on their attackers. Scratches, skin cells, blood transfer. Barbier's injuries raised suspicion. When asked about them, his explanations were vague. Accidents, clumsiness, nothing specific. Meanwhile, blood evidence recovered from the scene suggested the presence of a second blood type beyond Corinne's. Back then, blood typing could identify general groups. Type A, Type B, Type O. It could not identify a specific individual, but it could exclude. And the blood type found at the scene did not match Corinne's husband. It did align with Barbier. That mattered, but it was not enough. Because blood typing cannot place a person uniquely at a crime scene. It only narrows. Investigators pressed harder. Barbier denied involvement. No confession. No eyewitness placing him inside the home at the time of the murder. The case built slowly. Circumstantial pieces. Injuries. Blood type. Opportunity. Yet without DNA technology, prosecutors faced a difficult decision. Was it enough to convict? In the late 1960s, forensic certainty was not what it is today. Defense attorneys could argue coincidence, alternative explanations, contamination, and juries were cautious when physical evidence lacked specificity. Barbier was arrested, charged, but as proceedings moved forward, weaknesses in the forensic case became clear. The blood evidence could not uniquely identify him. The injuries, while suspicious, were not definitive proof of murder. And without a confession or eyewitness, doubt remained. The legal system requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. Not strong suspicion, not probability. Proof. Ultimately, Barbier was released. The charges did not hold, and Corinne Snyder's case went cold. For her family, this outcome felt like a second loss. They had believed investigators were close. They had believed justice was within reach. Instead, uncertainty returned. The file was closed, not solved, just dormant, and James Barbier walked free. Cold cases carry a particular tension when a suspect has once been arrested. Because the question lingers, Was the right man almost caught? Or was suspicion misplaced? For decades, Coren's name faded from headlines. But the evidence did not disappear. Biological samples were preserved, clothing stored, slides cataloged. Though technology at the time could not extract individual DNA profiles, investigators saved what they could. That decision would matter later. As years passed, forensic science advanced dramatically. By the 1990s and 2000s, DNA analysis had transformed criminal investigations. Cases once built on blood type could now be tested for genetic identity. Profiles could be extracted from decades-old evidence if properly preserved. In 2022, Coren Snyder's case was reopened. Not because of a new witness, not because of a confession, but because modern technology offered something that 1966 could not. Certainty. The preserved biological evidence was sent to advanced forensic laboratories. Technicians carefully extracted DNA. It was a delicate process. Older samples degrade. Contamination risks increase over time. But in this case, enough material survived. A usable DNA profile was developed. The question investigators had waited decades to answer was simple. Would it match James Barbier? A comparison was made. The result was clear. The DNA from the crime scene matched Barbier. Not just blood type, not probability, genetic identity. The science that did not exist in 1966 now spoke without ambiguity. After more than half a century, the suspect once released was identified definitively. But reopening a case after decades presents legal challenges. Double jeopardy. Laws protect individuals from being tried twice for the same crime after acquittal. In Barbier's case, because charges had not resulted in a full acquittal verdict at trial, legal pathways remained open. Prosecutors moved carefully, re-examining every step, ensuring procedure was flawless this time. Because history had already shown how fragile cases can collapse without airtight evidence. Coren Snyder's family, now older, received news that many had stopped expecting. The man once suspected, the man once released, now tied to the crime with scientific certainty. But closure after decades is complicated. It forces families to relive pain. It confirms suspicions long held. And it raises difficult reflections. If DNA had existed in 1966, would Coren's case have been resolved immediately? Would years of uncertainty have been avoided? Science cannot change the past. It can only illuminate it. In Part 2, we'll explore how prosecutors navigated the legal complexity of retrying a decades-old suspect, how modern forensic testimony reshaped a case once built on weak blood typing, and how Coren Snyder's name, nearly lost to time, returned to the center of a courtroom after more than 50 years. Coren Snyder. Part 2. When the DNA results confirmed the match to James Barbier, investigators felt something rare in cold cases. Certainty. Not theory. Not suspicion. Certainty. But certainty in a laboratory does not automatically translate into conviction in a courtroom. Prosecutors understood they were stepping into complicated territory. More than 50 years had passed. Memories had faded. Witnesses had aged. Some had died. Physical locations tied to the crime had changed or disappeared entirely. And most importantly, Barbier had once walked free. That history would matter. The first step was reviewing the original legal outcome from the 1960s. Barbier had been arrested and charged, but the case did not end in a definitive jury acquittal after a full trial verdict. procedural weaknesses, and insufficient forensic certainty at the time meant prosecutors could not sustain the case. That detail allowed modern prosecutors to move forward without violating double jeopardy protections. Still, the defense would argue aggressively. They would emphasize the passage of time. They would highlight potential evidence degradation. They would question whether the original investigation contaminated anything. Cold cases demand meticulous preparation. Every document from 1966 was reviewed again. Interview transcripts, evidence logs, chain of custody records, even small clerical notes became important. Because if any link in the evidence chain appeared broken, the defense could use it to undermine confidence. Forensic scientists prepared to explain not only the DNA match, but also the evolution of technology. They needed jurors to understand something crucial. The reason Barbier was not convicted in 1966 was not because he was innocent. It was because science had not advanced enough to prove guilt conclusively. In the courtroom, the prosecution built a narrative that spanned decades. They walked jurors through the original crime scene, Corinne's struggle, the defensive wounds, the blood evidence that at the time could only be typed broadly. They explained how blood typing narrowed the suspect pool, but could not identify one individual uniquely. Then they introduced modern DNA profiling. They described how preserved biological samples were carefully extracted, how genetic markers were compared, how the statistical probability of a coincidental match was astronomically low. The defense countered with familiar strategies. They questioned storage methods from the 1960s. They implied possible contamination during evidence handling. They suggested investigative bias once Barbier had been identified decades earlier. They argued that prosecutors had always wanted him to be guilty. But science does not operate on desire. It operates on measurable comparison. The DNA match placed Barbier at the crime scene in a way blood typing never could. Beyond the lab, prosecutors reintroduced the behavioral evidence from 1966. Barbier's unexplained injuries, fresh scratches consistent with a victim fighting back, his inconsistent statements during questioning, the fact that his blood type matched the unknown sample found at the scene. In 1966, those elements were suggestive. In 2022, combined with DNA, they became powerful reinforcement. Corinne's surviving family members attended the proceedings. For them, the trial felt surreal. Some had grown up hearing about the arrest that failed, about the frustration, about the feeling that justice had slipped through their fingers. Now they were sitting in a courtroom watching science correct history. Cold case trials carry a different emotional weight than recent ones. The grief has matured. It has settled, but it has never disappeared. When Corinne's name was spoken in court, it carried decades of silence behind it. The prosecution emphasized that time does not dilute truth. If anything, it sharpens it, because evidence preserved carefully can outlast human memory. One of the most compelling moments came when forensic experts explained the DNA comparison in simple terms. They described genetic markers as a biological fingerprint. They showed charts comparing crime scene DNA to Barbier's profile. Every marker aligned. The statistical probability that the DNA belonged to someone else was virtually non-existent. Jurors listened carefully. Modern audiences understand DNA in ways previous generations did not. They have seen its role in exonerations. They have seen its role in convictions. It carries credibility. The defense attempted one final strategy. They appealed to the difficulty of judging events from 1966 using modern expectations. They argued that societal standards, investigative techniques, and record-keeping were different. They asked jurors to consider whether certainty today could truly reflect events half a century earlier. But the prosecution returned to something simple. DNA does not care what year it is. It does not change based on legal arguments. It simply matches or it does not. After deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty. For Corinne's family, the word landed heavily. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph, only a quiet release of tension carried for more than 50 years. Justice delayed is complicated. It cannot restore lost time. It cannot give Corinne the life she was denied. But it replaces doubt with confirmation. And confirmation matters. James Barbier, once released due to technological limits, was now held accountable because science had advanced. Corinne Snyder's case became another example of how cold cases can thaw when evidence is preserved properly. It also became a reminder of how fragile justice can be when tools are limited. In 1966, investigators suspected Barbier strongly. But suspicion is not proof. Today, proof came from molecules invisible to the human eye. Corinne's story, once nearly forgotten outside her family, returned to public attention, not as a mystery, but as a resolved truth. And in the world of cold cases, resolution, even decades later, carries profound weight, because every unsolved file represents someone waiting to be named. Every preserved evidence box represents a chance for the future to speak. In Corinne Snyder's case, the future finally did. And after more than half a century, her story was no longer unfinished.